So I want to give a lecture regarding Max Beckmann, George Grosz, and Otto Diess, who I see as the three major painters of the Weimar Republic in Germany. And we've discussed in great depth the katabatic descent of modernity as it is portrayed symbolically in text, particularly zeroing in recently on Trakl and Kafka. The Kafka works, I think, are mostly textual. I think that's mostly written work of mine, and it hasn't been portrayed yet in oratory. But this immense fracture point, we've gotten closer and closer to the diagnostic center, which of course is Germany in World War I and World War II. And with Beckmann and Diess and Grosz, I think it's incredibly interesting to see Heidegger's question emerge roughly 2 decades after the major compression zone or the chamber of modernity as it collapses fundamentally in the political and historical action of World War I into World War II, and the economic, social, and political effects that occur in Germany therein. This really is the bankrupting of Germany after World War I and the political crisis that occurs therein, which results in the new regime, which mounts into World War II, Nazi Germany. And when we have Beckmann, Diess, and Grosz, we're having a visual confrontation with the decay of modernity and the epicenter of modernity's decay, which is the collapse of Germany, which Nietzsche articulates, and Heidegger inherits this mantle. And this, in my opinion, is precisely why Nietzsche and Heidegger are so important to the history of early 20th century philosophy, because they themselves are standing at ground zero of the crisis of modernity as it occurs specifically in Europe. And there's several different layers to Diess, Grosz, and Beckmann. Beckmann is we could say, the metaphysical crisis, wherein the archetype takes precedence. Masks, actors, triptychs, the sense of a mythic collapse that is occurring. Whereas with Diess, we have a highly embodied carnage, most of his work being obsessed with mechanized death and war, World War I in particular, which he participated in. The loss of the human body and the turning of the human body into industrial material. And then we have Grosz, who frequently depicts politicians, businessmen, clergy, officers as kind of swollen caricatures and mannequins, alcoholics and machines and puppets. So there's a triptych within these three artists, which is showing the spectacle of the descent into fascism, everything from the psychic manipulation in mass and the humiliation of Grosz's political modernity to Dies's embodied crisis of war, which is depicted viscerally in the mechanized death and the rotting trenches of his paintings. And Beckmann's layer, which is the metaphysical archetypal crisis, which is the spiritual underbelly, so to speak, which is the myth of modernity, which has become theatrical, fractured, and contorted, dream inside a collapsing civilization. And this is why Weimar Germany, we have such a fertile period of creativity, where Kurt Wolff is publishing in journals Trakl, one of the greatest poets of modernity, and Kafka, one of the greatest novelists and short story writers of modernity, in the same journal, in the same pamphlet at the same time. This is also the triptych of Beckmann, Diess, and Grosz that we experience. We have this mass outpouring of the possibilities of art in this period of time. And these possibilities are precisely by the collapse that is being wrought in this period. So this collapse is the opening up of the metaphysical ground, which is the ground of the ontos, which Heidegger later is interrogating approximately 20 years later after the major writers and artists that I just iterated. And this is what I think is fascinating, is that the question is asked 20 years after the answer is given. And why is this? Because the collapse is being experienced first through poetry and second through philosophy. And this is the dialectical tension of poetry and philosophy, which is to say, as we understand with Trackle, and this was why I was going back and forth between Trackle and Eliot, is that Eliot is a poet-philosopher. Eliot is a poet-metaphysician. And he stands between Heidegger and Trackle in that he can see and experiences and lives in both worlds as a critic, a metaphysical thinker, almost something of a theologian as well as a poet. But Trackle himself is totally embodied in the somatic experience of collapse of modernity. And this also, I believe, in large part has to do with the periods in which these artists and thinkers come to maturation. The extent of the crisis and this fulmigation of what is unfolding in the Weimar Republic and Germany during and after World War I into World War II, this crisis is fundamentally somatic and it's embodied. It's not intellectualized or reflective. So this experience is happening first at the level of the soma, or at the level of the nervous system. And there is no context and there's no concept by which this crisis can be articulated by way of metaphysical structure or by critical reflection. The faculty of the concepts to describe modernity have not been created yet. The crisis is a chamber of the body, because it is an ontological crisis, as Heidegger says, but it's also a political, historical, economic, cultural crisis, which is being underwent at the level of the body in relation to history, at ground zero, which is the collapse of Germany. And this is what I find so fascinating about these thinkers and writers, particularly Kafka, Trackle, and the three artists, the visual artists, is that the crisis is being rendered out from the collapsing civilizational ontos ground, which is to say the civilizational logic or relation to being, which is ultimately proved to be artifice as the culture itself descends into a madness predicted by Nietzsche and understood by Jung. And what I mean by this is that these are sirens of modernity. This is how I think of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche is a siren of the collapse of modernity, a syntactic and symbolic collapse of modernity at the level of the ontos, both in his statement, of course, God is dead, but also in his metaphysical declarations, particularly Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which Jung goes deeply into, because there's an understanding in Jung, astutely in Nietzsche, and as he observes the collapse of Germany, that, again, Jung and Freud are also coming out of Germany at this period of time, that what is unfolding is a mass psychic fracture at the level of ontological destabilization, wherein the downstream effects, political, economic, social, cultural, relational, vision or image of the self, that these downstream effects are that which is being experienced somatically. And this requires necessary ground. And Jung, as well as Nietzsche, both do significant inner work. And by inner work, I mean examination of the self. So they're standing on ontological footing, which is, of course, the great task of philosophy, to know thyself, to know the ontos. But this crisis that's being experienced by Beckmann and Grosz and Dies and Kafka and Trackle is the ground being ripped out from under, which is, it's not the metaphysician's ground. It's not Heraclitus' ground. That ground is cosmological, ontological ground. The ground being ripped out from under the artists and literary figures of Weimar Republic Germany is ground of the experience of being in time without the necessary critical cosmological situation. So this descent is somatic. It is the descent into hell viscerally without structural footing. So when we have Trackel's Blue Dreams, we have Kafka's genetic mutations into the cockroach, and we have Beckmann's murderous mythological scenes of masks and circus performers and kings in his triptychs and symbolic voyages. We have Deese's rotting trenches and mechanized death, decomposition, and prosthetic reconstruction. And we have the pig-like and swollen alcoholic businessmen and politicians, the corrupt officers and clergy. These are enlargements. They are the perceptual aperture of the descent organism, in that the civilization itself, and by and large the world, particularly Europe, is undergoing a metaphysical descent into hell, which is to say the ontological ground of the entire civilization is gone, is disappearing. It no longer can hold, as Yeats says, the center can no longer hold in this crucible of modernity, which is a technological industrialization in which this disfiguration occurs and is occurring, and it is being grasped at face value by these artists, both the visual and the textual, Trackel, Kafka, and the three visual artists. This experience of this highly enhanced creativity, which I would almost say is exponential genius, is emerging from this high contrast confrontation with an uninhabitable terrain, the disappearance of the ontological ground, and the real historical effects, which again are economic and life and death based. They are physical realities. They're somatic nervous system level realities of collapse. And this groundless collapse produces the confrontation with the face behind the mask of modernity, so to speak, which is corruption, industrial violence, spectacle, humiliation, rotting trenches and mutilation. This confrontation with this civilizational industrial death, this death market, which is being rent in Germany from the ashes of a dead age, a dead century, a dead millennium of belief, which is Nietzsche's former village towns and a sort of almost pagan Germany of a local religious enclave, which is a slow culture, a slow theological and literal material culture of trade, exchange, community, which has been shattered by the revolution of the factory and the industrial firearm, trench warfare, airplane warfare, right, as we descend into the 20th century. This is a shock at the level of the body, which is the perceptual aperture. This nervous system level somatic shock is registering in these sensitive individuals, which I've formalized substantially in both my Renaissance mind theory as well as my Atlas theory, which is an allostatic theory, neural relationship to life. That is, these sensitive beings, who therein we usually call the artists or the poets, are expressing and externalizing this internal somatic level experience of shattered myth, of shattered ontos, of Abgrund. This is why we experience hell in Deese and Beckmann and Kafka and Trackel and Grosz. We experience hell because these are not simply, and this is what's so powerful about the expressive mode of modernity. Of course, we have Dada, everything from Dada and Surrealism that emerged during this period of time, and because these are somatic level responses to this level of existential exposure, which is the loss of the ground of the ontos in a worldwide sense, which has real effects on the body. Again, this is economic, this is cultural, this is relational. This is the sphere which Mayakovsky calls everyday life, or byt. That this has become so destabilized and so dysfunctional and so absurd, again with Camus, right? This theme of absurdity, that it has become such a blown out circus or carnival that the experiences that Goya uses, right, in his black paintings become common parlance. This is an experience that is being articulated across the great artists and great literary figures of modernity, because the experience has become not in the sense of maybe an isolated mad genius such as Heraclitus or Goya, but it has become an industrialized condition of profound alienation wherein the collective ontos has become so absurd that the dissociation from the ontological ground has become absolute. And this is what we experience in the profound profusion of artistry at the turn of the Weimar Republic, because it is a mass collapse, and art, as I've described in my Law of Being and General Theory of Magnitude, is itself the necessity of externalizing this condition. Art is not then a luxury; it is a way of metabolizing collapsing constraint, the collapse of persistence. It is a way of processing metabolically the hollowing out of bourgeois civilization in the European metaphysical order. That this is as Dies so often depicts, and Grosz, less so Beckmann, because it's more of an archetypalized myth space, but nonetheless the same message is being delivered, that this is a total industrial mechanized war on consciousness itself. And these are the ill effects we see over a century later, is that this is the exponential banner of progress, which is nothing more or less than a total standing orderization of nature itself, as Heidegger puts it, that all of nature and all of man and all of life has been turned into a calculus of power, force, and influence. And this is what we see as the winning powers of World War I begin to divide up the world, the globe, with a knife, as is one of the famous propaganda cartoons of the time, as well as into World War II, where this burst of exponential industrial technological power reaches new heights with the atom bomb. So these are such profound depictions because they are in many ways now eternal, as technological modernity has only continued to accelerate exponentially, right? As the energetic harvest of fossil fuels and electricity and atomic energy continues to accelerate, right? To maybe perhaps a tipping point, is that the mask of the pre-modern ontos having been peeled off, the political, social, and moral collapse of Grosz, the alcoholic mannequin politician, and the pig-like officer, or the bureaucrat, or the judge, the twisted, mangled body of Otto Dies in the industrial war machine, rotting in a trench, covered in prosthetics and shrapnel, the dissociating dream of a symbolic voyage and violent captivity, violent bondage of Max Beckmann. It almost looks like a mythological depiction, and you look closer and there's this profound fascistic mechanized violence that's occurring within the painting. These themselves are works of the collapse of meaning in relation to being into a environment of grotesque theater and political violence, spectacle and control by way of coercion and psychological manipulation. So this is an idea here that we could describe as the automation of consciousness, that technological industrial modernity is the creation of a total ecosystem of pure efficiency and standing order, in which the entire world, as well as the human body, is weaponized and fractured, that these industrial systems enter into flesh, literally via the shrapnel or the prosthetic, the mustard gas, that the human body itself has been terraformed, and Marx talks about this in the Grunge Reis. It's that the laborer with the machine has almost fallen in love with it in this rhythmic unity wherein the machine and the laborer become one. And this is very prescient in relation to digital technological modernity as an industrial force, that the human being is collapsed into composable parts, that consciousness itself is being rent, as we can see with artificial intelligence, into a symbolic market wherein the human history of expressed symbols are being remixed and admixed into endless inventories of new form, which is supposedly a conquering of knowledge, so to speak, if that such a thing is possible. But these are, again, somatic experiences. To read Kafka in the age of artificial intelligence is to understand that the symbolic order, or the symbolic essence of Kafka, has been appropriated into a kind of a plasticine recompression or remixing of the lived, felt experience of the existential self in the collapse of modernity. That the metamorphosis and the cockroach are all of a sudden now purely symbols, or purely a symbolic ledger, or a sort of symbolic liturgy, which can be mechanized and changed and shifted to fit any sort of narrative inquiry. That no longer is the symbolic production of consciousness grounded in the body, rather it's in this artificial chamber of the remixing of symbols. And this is a principle which is discussed at length by Heidegger and Benjamin, Brecht, and the figures that emerge from this time who are recognizing this crisis as a fundamentally human and humanitarian crisis. It's a crisis of the first order, as technological consciousness and mass symbolic systems and industrial perception fragment the modern self to the point of which there's a question of who and what is the human being. And Camus articulates this in his lecture on the human crisis. This is an early formulation. This is an early formulation at the beginning of the 20th century, and we are now 100 years past this early formulation. The hysteria that comes of it, nationalism as a theatrical hysteria, capitalism and bureaucracy turning people into machines or functions, as described in Kafka, in works such as The Trial. Modernity producing psychic fragmentation, as in literal fragmentation in the body. This is nervous system instability and nervous system overwhelm unto physical collapse, which was not being stabilized by an ontological ground or a myth system which was uniting the nation, nonetheless the world, other than in Nazi Germany, which was a claim towards the return of the ground, right? The return of the myth of ancient pre-modern Germany, that this German Volk could once again be reclaimed, even though history itself had utterly changed, and this idea or image of the German Volk may well have never existed. Mass media and spectacle reorganizing consciousness. This was a huge part of the speeches and the propaganda movement of Hitler, including Riefenstahl. The movement and acceleration of cinema and the radio played a huge role in this. Bourgeois civilization spiritually hollowed out by the collapse of the old European metaphysical order. And this was collapsing by way of the technological turn, which was not only mechanized war, but the factory, which was a thermodynamic revolution of electricity and industrial power. This total violence of the paradigm shift, which is, you could literally be described as a thermodynamic and thermonuclear phase change by the weaponization of industrial modernity, which is a fossil fuel weaponization. It is an oil weaponization in which we are still dealing with the outcomes and outproducts of that today in terms of the issue of powering this new industrial world with the masses of people and systems which now populate it and rely upon fossil fuels. So these artists, right, again, 20 years before Heidegger, understood that industrial modernity had fundamentally altered the human body, perception, mass psychology, violence, symbolic life, and the very structure of the self, that the world in which was being lived was changing, and that the forces which emerged from it, the pig-headed bankers and the twisted prosthetic mustard-gassed dead, and the broken bound myths of Max Beckmann were articulations of the forces emerging from this Pandora's box of modernity, which was a phase change and a shift of the energetic conditions of being in time. Not only at the level of Germany itself, which was ground zero of this ontological collapse and expressed as such politically and spiritually, particularly through the bankrupting of Germany in World War I. But additionally, at the level of modern consciousness, as a global phenomenon, as industrial technology terraforms the globe, compresses space and time, both in terms of information and goods, and the relationships that occur therein between nations, and the collapse, even as it began, of the concept of the nation state, almost within a span of decades. That this space of nations, which was formerly only traversed by ships, if it was as such, is then traversed by planes and is then traversed by the internet. So this is an exponential acceleration of space and time. And in this crisis, again, the metaphysical crisis, which is the meaningful relationship to being, the human body is transformed utterly into industrial material, as presciently articulated by Marx and the Grundrisse. The hidden foundations of the 20th century, and this is still the outcome, which, again, I've articulated in relationship to Christina Sharp in the phenomenon of the slave ship of the 1500s, and how the slave ship compressed space and time and human being into pure body, physical product. This is a process which is occurring over centuries and accelerating, and hits a tipping point at the beginning of the 20th century as a thermodynamic phase change in modern industrial civilization. And this, again, as Marx discusses with alienation and fragmentation of the self, this is highly prescient. Regardless of Marx's political or economic theoretical ideas, you have to examine Marx as a diagnostician of the physical conditions of emerging modernity, and Marx being perhaps the preeminent diagnostician of these physical emerging conditions of modernity. Physical in the sense of thermodynamic and neural. That there is a real lived physical occurring relationship that is changing in industrial modernity, which is thermodynamic in terms of factory, and neural in terms of acceleration and change in the way in which work occurs, with the light bulb in the endless factory, the stabilization of New York City in America as the city that never sleeps. This is far and away from an agrarian setting in Germany, wherein the greatest fuel was the plowshare, and work abided by the somatic, deep ancestral rhythms of the sun and the moon. And these rhythms were abided agriculturally to produce and preserve the possibility of the community, which is to say, the necessary food. This is an absolute phase change of humanity's relationship to self and world. And this is precisely why modernity is itself not only the collapse of civilizations, but the collapse of the ontological connection of the human being to cosmos, to being, by way of the introduction of a simulated, exponentially growing industrial environment, which is the harnessing of latent energy, right? Again, deep within the core of the earth, this energy is dredged up and harvested, creating a manufactured and manufacturing environment in which the human being is appropriated as part of and a critical aspect of the standing order, the total instrumentalization of relations upon earth. So when Heidegger gestures back to Greece, or Nietzsche experiences the loss of the tether between this pre-modern agrarian unified religious communal culture of Germany into this twisted industrial technological National Socialist Germany, which itself is industrializing and claiming world power upon even the precept or the concept of returning to this mythic era. This experiential phase change is a total removal, a total somatic and neurological and deep ancestral genetic uplifting from the grounds of the human condition as regulated by the somatic rhythms of sun and moon and season into this harsh light of the factory prison or prism of technological modernity, which itself is a profound simulation away from and against the conditions in which the human being ancestrally prospered and related to and connected to nature itself. So this is the loss of the ground in which Goethe formulates Faust, is, again, Faust being prescient and understanding this change that is occurring, particularly through science, and science, again, being intimately related to technology. That this ground itself is now translated into the artificial environment in which the human being no longer exists in intimate relationship to being, in the possibility space of disclosure, but instead in this entirely economized relationship to being in which the human being is itself economized. The labor is totally appropriated into hours, economic units, systems that measure and monitor, increasingly as we move into digital modernity, performance, production. And so this total instrumentalization of human being, even as it accelerates in the century after the Weimar Republic, is precisely the alienation that Marx is experiencing and discussing in his Grundrisse and in Capital. But furthermore, the alienation that Heidegger is experiencing and discussing at the level beneath it, which is the ontological alienation, the being away from disclosure to such an extent that the question has to be asked, is meaningful relationship to being possible? And Heidegger turns to Hölderlin, and Hölderlin is of course in this relationship to the gods as natural forces, as forces of nature that Hölderlin experiences in nature. And Heidegger refers to this again in his analysis of the Greek poets, that the Greek poets themselves continuously describe relationship to being as experienced in nature, as in relationship to nature in which the human being is ultimately collapsed somatically and enfolded into the natural environment, and this itself being the mode of relationship of the Greek. And this is what Heidegger experiences and has intimate relationship to as a philosopher who is also a poet, because he is smithing with language. Heidegger's philosophy itself is a thinking with language, a languaging, which himself is a work, like Eliot in his time, of returning to the innocence of the poetic practice of relationship to being, articulating and being in communion with disclosure as the practice of poetry, which is not necessarily writing. For Heidegger is very often speaking. So this relationship which Heidegger is seeking to recover, that Nietzsche is stranded between and that Trakl and Diess are submerged in, is a historical process of technological and industrial revolution, which is itself converting the human being into a standing order, fragmenting the human being into an industrial labor unit, as described by Marx, which then becomes a technological position and technological relation to nature as extraction. Extraction of labor, extraction of good, extraction of energetic unit, which is from tree to jungle to oil. And that nature is converted entirely into a standing order, which then is a symbolization of nature, is that nature is now countable. And this countability is the crisis, is the ontological crisis articulated by Kafka in Metamorphosis, articulated by Beckett in Waiting for Godot, articulated by Lispector in Passion of G.H., experienced at depth, as in somatic, subconscious depth by Trakl, who also was a World War I veteran, as was Celine, as was Dies. These are figures who experienced at the ground level the birth of industrial world warfare, the degree to which humanity had been shattered from the shared myth into the private symbolic prison and the closed neural system of the collapse of civilizations into the compressed space of industrial technological unit, dispersed into warfare, prosthetically reconstructed, decomposed, rotting in trenches, covered in prosthetics, littered with shrapnel, married with mustard gas. This disfiguration emerging from this paradigm shift phase change, which produces the pig-headed politician, the alcoholic mannequin businessman, the puppet officers and machine clergy, the swollen characters of George Grosz. And this is why George Grosz is so important. These are literal depictions of the formulation which is bubbling up psychosomatically in this phase change of industrial technological modernity. Dies is depicting the literal horrors of war. Dies is much more of a painter of, we could say, social realism of Germany in World War II. George Grosz is depicting the twisted face of the underbelly, the swollen caricature of this emergent National Socialist order in the face of the Weimar Republic, this spectacle and industrial violence, which is the twisting face of the mass psychic manipulation, which is the energetic currency made available by industrial technological modernity, and the attempt to grasp this and weaponize it into a faceless, empty system of currency, pure extraction of energy emerging from this fossil fuel relationship. We experience this in the United States as well with the great industrialists, so to speak. This is the cultivation of labor slavery and modernity, which we understand very well in terms of the coal mines, in which American immigrants and even famous baseball players such as Jake Daubert and Stan Kovaleski were born into this labor slavery. And of course, Hitler and Nazi Germany take a page out of the American book in terms of the slavery of black people in the United States. Again, many great baseball players emerge from that history as well, including Rube Foster and Satchel Paige. So we have this experience which is being articulated, this shattering. And what is necessary, and I'll go back to Grosz on this because I think it's very, very important, he's different than Beckmann, who is more abstracted, and Dies, who is more literal, that Grosz inhabits this underbelly in depicting the psychological face of the collapse of civilization in terms of who and what these people really are, the politicians, the businessmen, the authors, and the clergy. They're the twisted face of this emerging social theater, this grotesque social theater, which is the political moral collapse of Weimar Germany, into the consolidation of capital, this emerging energetic power which is being grappled for and jostled with by these figures who are these bursting masks of spectacle and humiliation, weaponization of the human being, weaponization of nature. That this is a mutilated state of modernity, which Kafka and Trakl understand very well. I'm keeping this very much so within Germany because I think it's very important. This mutilated state of modernity is a perverted and terraformed relationship to nature, which is lost of the Greek ensoulment or the presence of being within nature, which is the poetic dwelling, that man dwells poetically. And Hölderlin warns of this. Man thinks he dwells with virtue, but he dwells poetically. That the virtue, in Hölderlin's terms, has been utterly weaponized. It has been utterly converted into the industrial technological unit. That nature itself and the human body and the human being itself is now nothing more than a unit of measure. And that this itself is the first mutilation and first decomposition, which Dies, Beckmann, and Grosz are depicting on the metaphysical, literal, in terms of the war of Dies, and psychosomatic in terms of Grosz levels of this corruption, which is a total ontological corruption, which culminates in the question that Heidegger asks. And we see this at the ground level in Germany, because Germany is this sinkhole of simultaneous ontological collapse and the total bottoming out of an economy, which produces the frantic, mad state of the brief Weimar Republic, which is this period of desperate attempt at creative and existential liberation, which collapses, utterly collapses, into World War II and the rise of Nazi Germany, because, again, of this desperate economic condition, which is a deep somatic and nervous system contracting of the possibilities of existence itself. At the same time, of course, we have Mayakovsky in Red Russia, who is there's a similar phase change process that's occurring at this period of time in the early 1900s, particularly the 1910s. World War I is a profound period of revolution, because the world is now modernizing and for the first time confronting, by way of industrial technology, enhanced real relationship and real confrontation of previously isolated cultural and civilizational units. And this is conducted first and foremost by way of warfare, as in World War I. This is really one of the first major world turning about faces to encounter the other. And this, of course, is another profound aspect of the Dada and Surrealist turns which occur in Germany, as well as the Expressionist cinema, Bauhaus, Jung and Freud. This is an expansion of the possibility of the ontological terrain, which we have discussed, modernity being this necessary step into the abyss, the collapse of the pre-modern ontology, which Heidegger stands in the middle of and says, what is the possibility of meaningful relationship to being? And it was poetry for Heidegger, and it still is poetry for me. It still is poetry to this day, because poetry is dwelling within being. It is the possibility of disclosure. And it is the craft and practice of innocence, which is languaging. Languaging being thinking in relation to being. This is the existentialist mode of thought, and I want to extend this proposition of poetry into Beckett and Camus and Sartre. I want to extend it because it is the philosophical question of the interrogation into being and what it is to be, what it means to be, and that this question is what draws us close to the ontos, even in periods of extreme technological, political, social, economic collapse. Because this is itself the deepest ground, and this interrogation of this ground is the same ground that Rumi or Meister Eckhart are interrogating. This is a world historical ground of the mystics. And this is the ground which is utterly necessary in Germany in this period of, we could say, maybe the span of 30 years. Because there is no other ground. There is no political, there's no social, there's no economic, there's no cultural ground. This ground is being frantically searched for, found, and created, and this is the explosion of Kafka, Brecht, Benjamin. This is the advent of Céline's new nervous system language, his new way of writing the novel, which is revolutionary. It is Beckett's theater. These are attempts at finding meaningful relationship to being and finding disclosure in the collapsed modernity, the death knell, and the abyss, the after Auschwitz, so to speak, to use Adorno here. So this perhaps this condition and this explosion of existentialist literature, this was itself perhaps a luxury of the few who saw, we could say maybe Goya or Heraclitus, even Milton in his time, Shelley in his, that the luxury of this ontological search was a luxury of being in an ensouled cosmos, even as this cosmos was unbelievable to some, even as it was altered by Copernicus or Galileo or Darwin, that this ensouled cosmos of Shelley's time, the British Empire, or Milton's time, these times of the ancients, these times of the tribal, these times of the communal, that the ensouled cosmos need not be interrogated, but by way of the shamans or the few who saw it necessary to seek, such as Blaise Pascal or Spinoza. And these few who sought were ostracized, exiled, and alienated by these systems because these systems themselves stood and continued to stand until modernity. And the burst of profound existential thought, which I prize so deeply because I see it as the true art, which is the art of the individual interrogation into being, the descent into hell, which is the honor and the right of all great artists and spiritualists, as depicted probably best by Dante, but is common to Trackle as it is to Grosz, as it is to Kafka. This descent into hell, as it is to Lispector. The Lispector and Kafka connection is fascinating. The cockroach is being used there. But this descent into the pre-ontological ground, and I'll say the cockroach is sort of the primordial order of persistence. And I've described constraint itself being the ontological ground, the operator identity of existence and the cosmos and being itself. In my more theoretical, structural work, is that this descent is truly the honor and the responsibility and the privilege of all life, that what it is to be alive and to inhabit the human being at the existential level is to undergo one's own descent into hell and to discover for oneself what is the ground of being. This is one of Thoreau's kind of adamant statements, that this is not, that we are all philosophers and poets of the first order, and that we all require this descent to become that which we are by way of confronting the loss of ground, which is to say the void or the abyss. And that this void or abyss appears in modernity is that it appears globally. It is the world condition of absence, the flight of being, the flight of the gods, which Heidegger laments and Nietzsche predicts and sees, even as it is occurring, and Hölderlin sees the twilight of the gods. But it is these gods, right, which in the same way were a ground in which this interrogation could be withheld or delayed or made pending, suspended, the suspended ground upon which existence could occur without the critical interrogation which modernity forces upon each individual. Each individual is thrown back in and upon oneself in order to interrogate the nature of existence, as in that all systems therein, the former ontological grounds of civilizations, socialities, and cultures has been thrown. It no longer exists, it no longer is, and as such, what is required is a true interrogation of each individual, a true descent into hell, in order to recover the ontos. And this is what the descent into hell is at the most metaphysical, meta-architectural, and structural level. It is to recover the ontos. And this has been depicted in terms of Penelope, Inanna, Beatrice, Eurydice. There's a long history of this, and this also in the Gnostic would be considered the Sophia, the spark, the divine spark, which has been lost and thrown into being, which is interestingly connects to Heraclitus and the concept that all things are fire and return to fire. That to recover this divine spark is to recover the self. But that one can only do this for oneself, and that social or political or civilizational systems or cultural systems or symbolic orders cannot be opposed or symposed or made accurate or adequate to this condition, which is the existential condition of being human. And we see this period culminate in the existentialists themselves, most notably Camus and Sartre, wherein this is the primary command and perhaps the most fundamental unity between the two, even as they fall apart over political ideals, that both command that one finds this nature or this possibility within themselves, and that this is itself the dictate of modernity, and what modernity itself is bringing to light and bringing to bear and availing. The collapse, the rubble, the wasted land, and the hollow men who populate it, to speak with Eliot, that has only accelerated since this time, in the 100 years, Kafka to Camus, to the age of hypertrophying digital technological modernity, that this imperative has only grown louder. that this imperative has only grown more true, and that this is a calling at the deepest level for humanity or the human being to discover its true ontological roots in the face of the collapse and the death of the world. This is a profound calling, and this has always been the calling of the human being. To know who and what we are, to find who and what we are, and to become who and what we are by way of knowing, disclosing, finding, seeking, seeing, being, dwelling poetically upon the earth. And what does the poet seek for but innocent relationship to being? Truth. Thank you.